June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Barbarossa shattered the pre-dawn silence along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in history, surged eastward with a confidence bordering on arrogance. Adolf Hitler had declared the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards within 8 weeks. His generals shared this assessment. Soviet industry, concentrated in the western regions within easy reach of the Wehrmacht's advancing panzers, would be captured or destroyed before Stalin could react. What none of them knew was that at that exact moment, Soviet officials were already implementing a plan so audacious, so desperate, and so massive in scope that it would dwarf any industrial undertaking in human history. Within days of the German invasion, Soviet workers would begin dismantling entire factories bolt by bolt, loading them onto trains and shipping them thousands of miles eastward to rebuild beyond the reach of German bombers. Over the next 6 months, the Soviet Union would relocate 1,523 major industrial enterprises, including 1,360 large war plants, using 1.5 million railway cars. They would transport 10 million workers and their families to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. They would rebuild these factories in open fields during the brutal Russian winter, often beginning production before walls or roofs existed. This industrial exodus would prove to be Nazi Germany's fatal miscalculation. The genesis of this industrial evacuation plan predated the German invasion by years, though few in the Soviet leadership believed it would ever be necessary. During the 1930s, as Stalin drove the USSR through forced industrialization, Soviet planners had concentrated production in the western regions for practical reasons. The Ukraine, Belarus, and the industrial cities around Leningrad and Moscow possessed the infrastructure, the skilled workers, and the transportation links necessary for modern manufacturing. The Kharkov tractor plant employed 35,000 workers producing tanks and military vehicles. The Kirov plant in Leningrad manufactured heavy tanks and artillery. The Zaporozhye aluminum plant produced 60% of Soviet aluminum. These massive complexes represented decades of investment and millions of rubles. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the brilliant military theorist executed during Stalin's purges in 1937, had warned that concentration of industry in the western regions created catastrophic vulnerability. His proposals for dispersing critical production facilities eastward were dismissed as defeatist. After his execution, few dared raise the issue again. Yet some preparations were made quietly. Beginning in 1939, the State Defense Committee authorized construction of duplicate facilities in the Urals and beyond, though progress was slow and funding limited. When Germany invaded, these eastern facilities represented barely 20% of Soviet industrial capacity. The rest lay in the path of the Wehrmacht's advance. The man who would orchestrate the industrial evacuation was Nikolai Voznesensky, chairman of the State Planning Committee, Gosplan. On June 24, 1941, just 2 days after the invasion began, the Soviet government created the Council for Evacuation with Voznesensky as its driving force. His deputy, Alexei Kosygin, who would later become Soviet premier, handled the day-to-day logistics. What they faced was a task that defied imagination. They needed to identify which factories were most critical, determine how to dismantle them without destroying delicate machinery, find transportation for millions of tons of equipment, select sites thousands of miles away where factories could be rebuilt, and accomplish all this while German armies advanced at speeds of 50 miles per day. The Council for Evacuation worked from a building in Moscow that never went dark. Staff members operated in 24-hour shifts, coordinating with military commanders about German positions, railway officials about available rolling stock, and factory directors about what equipment could be moved and in what order. Priority lists were established and revised daily as the military situation changed. Tank factories received top priority, followed by aircraft plants, then artillery and ammunition production, and finally steel and aluminum production. The mathematics were brutal. Germany was producing approximately 500 tanks monthly. Soviet production before the invasion was roughly 300 tanks monthly. If the Germans captured the Kharkov and Leningrad tank plants, Soviet production would drop to perhaps 50 tanks monthly. the war would be lost in a matter of months through simple arithmetic. The first evacuations began in the last week of June 1941 in the Baltic states and Belarus, regions the Germans were overrunning with terrifying speed. At the Minsk auto plant, workers had just 3 days' warning before German spearheads arrived. They worked around the clock in shifts, using acetylene torches to cut away machinery bolted to concrete foundations, disconnecting electrical systems, draining coolant and lubricants, wrapping delicate instruments in whatever materials could be found. The most critical machine tools were loaded first, then the heavy presses, then anything else that could be moved. Workers painted identification numbers on every piece of equipment, though in the chaos many numbers were lost or duplicated. The last train carrying machinery from Minsk departed on June 28th, just hours before German tanks entered the city. Left behind were the factory buildings themselves, empty shells that the retreating Red Army would burn to deny them to the enemy. The scale of the operation expanded exponentially through July and August as the German advance continued. In Leningrad, the massive Kirov plant began evacuation in early July. This facility covered 150 acres and employed 25,000 workers. The plant's director, Isaac Zaltzman, later described the scene as organized pandemonium. The factory had been producing KV-1 heavy tanks, massive 47-ton vehicles with armor that German anti-tank guns could not penetrate. Every day the plant remained operational, it produced 3 of these invaluable weapons. Every day spent evacuating was a day without production. Zaltzman made the agonizing decision to maintain production while simultaneously beginning evacuation, splitting his workforce between the assembly lines and the dismantling crews. The railway system became the lifeline of the entire evacuation effort. Soviet railways, built to a wider gauge than European standard, used 1,520mm track spacing. This meant that when German forces captured Soviet railways, they had to convert them to standard gauge before using them, a process that took weeks. This quirk of engineering gave Soviet evacuation trains precious additional time. The People's Commissariat of Railways, NKPS, controlled approximately 106,000 kilometers of track in 1941. In peacetime, the system handled about 23,000 trains daily. During the evacuation, this number would double and then triple as passenger services were suspended, and every available locomotive and freight car was pressed into service. The trains themselves became moving cities. A typical evacuation train consisted of 60 to 70 freight cars, some carrying machinery, others carrying workers and their families. Families were given just hours to pack their belongings, usually limited to what they could carry. Many workers chose to bring their factories' blueprints, technical manuals, and specialized tools rather than personal possessions, understanding that these documents would be essential for a building. The trains departed with whatever fuel and water they could obtain, never certain they would reach their destinations. German aircraft attacked evacuation trains whenever they were spotted, though the Luftwaffe, focused on supporting the advancing ground forces, could devote only limited resources to interdicting rear area targets. The journey eastward typically took 2 to 3 weeks, covering distances of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers. Trains traveled slowly, stopping frequently to take on fuel and water, to let military trains pass in the opposite direction, and to repair track damaged by German bombing or partisan sabotage. There were no schedules, no timetables, only desperate improvisation. Train crews worked without rest, knowing that every hour of delay brought the Germans closer to cutting the rail lines. At night, trains ran without lights, navigating by the experience of engineers who had worked these routes for decades. During the day, they watched the skies constantly for German fighters. As trains rolled eastward, advance parties travelled ahead to identify suitable sites for rebuilding the factories. The criteria were brutally simple. The location needed rail access, a water source, and enough flat ground for factory buildings. Everything else was secondary. The cities of the Urals, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Magnitogorsk, became the primary destinations, though factories were also sent to Kazakhstan, Siberia, and Central Asia. Many sites had nothing. No buildings, no infrastructure, just empty land where temperatures would soon drop to 40 degrees below zero. The Kharkov diesel factory, arrived at its new location in the Urals in October 1941 to find an open field covered in early snow. The factory director, whose name has been lost to history, later described workers weeping when they saw the site. They had brought sophisticated machinery that required precision installation, temperature control, and protection from the elements. They had none of these things. What they did have was a workforce of 8,000 desperate men and women who understood that their family's survival and their nation's survival depended on getting this factory operational. Construction began immediately, even as more trains continued to arrive with additional equipment. Workers lived in tents and dugouts, then in rough barracks they built themselves. They worked in temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes, using tools that shattered from the cold. Machinery arrived damaged from transport, missing critical components, or without the necessary documentation. Workers improvised constantly, fabricating parts by hand when replacements were unavailable, redesigning layouts to accommodate the reality of their situation, rather than the plans drawn in Moscow. The most critical challenge was getting the machinery operational before the workers themselves succumbed to exposure and starvation. The statistics of this industrial migration defy comprehension. Between July and November 1941, Soviet railways moved 1.5 million railway carloads of equipment and people eastward. To put this in perspective, the entire D-Day invasion of Normandy required approximately 7,000 ships and landing craft to move 156,000 men and their equipment across the English Channel, a distance of perhaps 100 miles. The Soviet evacuation moved 10 million people and the machinery of 1,523 major factories across distances averaging 1,500 miles, while simultaneously fighting the largest land war in history. This was accomplished using a railway system under constant attack, with rolling stock that was already inadequate before the war, and with fuel supplies that were critically short. The human cost was staggering, though never fully documented. Workers froze to death during transport. Children died from exposure and disease. Families were separated and never reunited. Accidents were commonplace as exhausted workers operated dangerous machinery in desperate conditions. Food supplies were irregular and inadequate, with workers receiving perhaps 400 grams of bread daily when rations arrived at all. The Soviet government made no provisions for comfort or even basic safety. The only priority was production, getting the factories operational before Germany's industrial superiority became insurmountable. Yet, remarkably, the evacuated factories began producing again with almost unbelievable speed. The first tank rolled off a relocated production line in Chelyabinsk on October 10, 1941, just 2 months after evacuation began. This was the Tankograd complex, a massive facility created by merging the evacuated Kirov plant from Leningrad with the Kharkov diesel factory and the Chelyabinsk tractor plant. The facility operated without complete walls or roofing, with workers standing at assembly lines exposed to the elements, wearing whatever winter clothing they could obtain. Temperatures inside the factory were barely above freezing. Workers' fingers froze to metal tools. Machinery malfunctioned constantly in the cold, yet production continued and accelerated. The German High Command remained completely unaware of the scale of the Soviet evacuation. Wehrmacht intelligence, the Abwehr, had provided detailed information about Soviet industrial facilities in the western regions. As German forces captured these cities, they found the factories exactly where intelligence had indicated. They found them empty. Buildings stood intact but stripped of all machinery. German commanders reported capturing factory shells but no production capacity. These reports were noted but not fully understood. Hitler and his generals assumed Soviet industry had been effectively destroyed, that the capture of Leningrad, Moscow, and the Donetsk basin would eliminate Soviet capability to produce modern weapons. They were catastrophically wrong. The first indications that something unexpected was happening came in October and November 1941, as German forces encountered increasing numbers of Soviet tanks. The quantities were impossible according to German intelligence assessments. The Soviets should have been running out of tanks, yet they kept appearing in greater numbers. On the Moscow front, Soviet counterattacks employed tank formations that shouldn't have existed. German generals requested updated intelligence assessments, but the Abwehr had no explanation. Their reports of destroyed Soviet industry were accurate. The factories in captured territories were indeed gone. What they missed was that those factories had been relocated and were already producing again. By December 1941, as the German advance stalled before Moscow and the brutal Russian winter set in, Soviet war production had stabilized and begun to increase. The evacuated plants were reaching full operation. Tankograd was producing 20 tanks daily. The aircraft factories relocated to the Volga region were assembling fighters and bombers at increasing rates. The ammunition plants were supplying shells for the artillery that would devastate German positions throughout the winter. This production increase was achieved despite losing 60% of pre-war industrial capacity to German occupation. The relocated 40% was producing more than the entire industrial base had before the war, through sheer desperation and sacrifice. The Magnitogorsk Metallurgical Combine exemplified Soviet industrial determination. This massive steel plant in the Urals had been built during the 1930s specifically to provide strategic depth to Soviet industry. When the war began, Magnitogorsk was expanded to absorb evacuated steel production facilities from the Ukraine and the Donets Basin. The combine employed 45,000 workers operating blast furnaces and rolling mills 24 hours daily. Steel production reached levels that equaled the entire German steel industry. This single facility in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from the front lines, became the foundation of Soviet tank and artillery production. Without Magnitogorsk steel, the relocated tank factories would have been useless. Aircraft production followed a similar pattern of evacuation and reconstruction. The aircraft industry proved even more challenging to relocate than tank production because aircraft manufacturing required more specialized facilities and more skilled workers. The Ilyushin and Yakovlev design bureaus evacuated from Moscow to Kuibyshev in October 1941. The factories producing MiG and La-G fighters moved to Siberia. The Tupolev Bureau relocated to Omsk. The dispersal of aircraft production across multiple distant sites should have paralyzed Soviet air power. Instead, through centralized control from Moscow and standardized production methods, the evacuated plants achieved coordination that German intelligence considered impossible. The IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft became the symbol of Soviet industrial resilience. This heavily armored attack plane was specifically designed to destroy German tanks and support Soviet ground forces. Production began before the war at Factory No. 18 in Voronezh. When this facility was threatened by German advance, it was evacuated to Kuibyshev on the Volga. The evacuation and reconstruction took just 6 weeks. By January 1942, Factory No. 18 in its new location was producing 10 IL-2S daily. By mid-1942, production reached 15 aircraft daily. The Germans, who had assumed Soviet aircraft production had been destroyed, found themselves facing increasing numbers of these heavily armored aircraft that their fighters struggled to shoot down and their ground forces learned to fear. The human dimension of the evacuation remains difficult to fully comprehend even today. The workers who rebuilt these factories in the Urals and Siberia were predominantly women, teenagers, and men too old or too disabled for military service. The able-bodied men were at the front, fighting the Germans. Those left behind were told explicitly that their work was equally important, that every tank they produced, every aircraft they assembled, every shell they manufactured saved Soviet lives at the front. This message was not propaganda but simple truth, and the workers understood it completely. Klavdia Pavlovna Zhukova worked at Tankograd assembling T-34 tank engines. She was 16 years old when she arrived from Leningrad in October 1941, evacuated with her factory. She later recalled working 12-hour shifts without days off, standing on a concrete floor in a factory without heat, her hands constantly numb from the cold. She assembled cylinder heads, a task requiring precision and care. Mistakes could cause engine failure that would leave tank crews helpless before German guns. She worked knowing this consequence, never allowing herself to make errors despite exhaustion and hunger. She was one of thousands of teenage girls doing similar work across the relocated industrial plants. The Soviet government provided minimal support for these workers beyond basic rations. Housing was primitive, often barracks with dozens sharing single rooms, or dugouts carved into hillsides. Medical care was rudimentary. Schools for evacuated children operated when possible but were frequently interrupted as teachers were pulled into factory work. The Stalinist system, brutal and totalitarian, proved grimly effective at extracting maximum production from minimum resources. Workers who failed to meet quotas faced punishment, ranging from reduction in rations to arrest. Those who exceeded quotas received modest bonuses and recognition as Stakhanovites, model workers named after a pre-war coal miner who had exceeded production norms. Yet coercion alone cannot explain the productivity achieved by these relocated factories. The workers understood they were fighting for survival not just of the Soviet state but of their families and their civilization. German occupation of Soviet territories brought mass murder, starvation, and enslavement. Every Soviet citizen knew someone who had disappeared into German captivity or been killed in occupied territories. The choice was stark: produce weapons or be conquered by an enemy that promised only death and slavery. This understanding drove workers to achievements that outsiders considered impossible. By the spring of 1942, Soviet war production had not only recovered but surpassed pre-war levels in key categories. Tank production reached 2,100 units monthly, more than double the June 1941 rate. Aircraft production exceeded 2,500 monthly. Artillery and ammunition production reached levels that would support the massive offensives Soviet forces would launch beginning in late 1942. These production figures were achieved with a smaller industrial base than the Soviet Union possessed before losing territory to Germany. The evacuated and rebuilt factories were simply more productive than the original facilities had been, driven by desperate necessity and ruthless management. The German High Command slowly became aware that Soviet industrial capacity had not been destroyed as assumed. Captured Soviet soldiers revealed they were being equipped with new tanks and weapons rather than pre-war stockpiles running dry. German intelligence officers interrogated prisoners about where these weapons came from. The answers were consistent: factories in the Urals, in Siberia, in places German maps barely showed. The realization was slow to dawn, perhaps because it was so difficult to believe. The Germans had conquered Soviet territory containing 40% of the population and 60% of the industrial capacity. By any rational calculation, the Soviet Union should have been unable to continue fighting at the previous intensity, much less increase production. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Soviet forces had more tanks in late 1942 than they had in June 1941, despite 18 months of catastrophic losses. Hitler's response to this intelligence was characteristically delusional. He refused to accept that Soviet production could exceed German production. He insisted the numbers were exaggerated, that Soviet tanks were inferior and should not be counted equally with German panzers, that Soviet industry would collapse once Germany captured the remaining industrial centers. When the Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated conclusively that Soviet forces possessed overwhelming material superiority, Hitler blamed sabotage and treachery rather than acknowledge the reality that Soviet industry had outproduced German industry, while simultaneously evacuating and rebuilding. The statistics support a conclusion Hitler could not accept. In 1942, Soviet factories produced approximately 24,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany produced about 9,300. Soviet aircraft production reached 25,000 compared to German production of 15,400. Artillery production showed similar Soviet advantages. These numbers meant that even accounting for superior German training and tactics, the material balance was shifting decisively against Germany. The Wehrmacht would have to destroy 3 or 4 Soviet tanks for every German tank lost just to maintain parity, a ratio possible in 1941 but unsustainable by 1943 as Soviet crews gained experience and German forces were spread across multiple fronts. The relocated factories continually improved production methods and product quality throughout the war. The T-34 tank, already the war's best medium tank in 1941, underwent constant refinement. The T-34-85 variant with an improved 85mm gun appeared in 1944, giving Soviet tank crews a vehicle superior to the German Panzer IV and roughly equal to the Panther. Soviet factories produced over 22,000 of these improved tanks by war's end. The Germans, struggling with overcomplicated designs like the Tiger and Panther that required enormous resources to build and maintain, could not match Soviet production quantities while maintaining technological advantages. The IL-2 Sturmovik production reached absurd levels by German standards. Over 36,000 of these aircraft were built during the war, making it the most produced military aircraft in history. German pilots called it the Black Death for its effectiveness against ground targets and its resistance to fighter attacks. The heavily armoured cockpit and engine compartment meant IL-2S could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and return to base. Soviet factories built them faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, ensuring Soviet ground forces always had close air support while German forces faced constant air attack. The psychological impact on German forces of facing endless Soviet production proved as important as the material impact. German soldiers and tankers increasingly understood they faced an enemy that could replace losses indefinitely, while German losses were increasingly irreplaceable. Every destroyed Soviet tank would be replaced within days by new production. Every destroyed German tank took weeks or months to replace as German factories struggled with Allied bombing and resource shortages. This mathematical reality, obvious to frontline troops, undermined morale and fighting spirit more effectively than Soviet propaganda ever could. The evacuation's success rested on factors beyond Soviet willpower and sacrifice. Geography provided the Soviet Union with strategic depth that Germany could never overcome. The distances from the front lines to the Urals were simply too great for German air power to reach with meaningful effect. The Luftwaffe, designed for tactical support of ground forces rather than strategic bombing, lacked the heavy bombers necessary for sustained attacks on distant targets. German He-111 and Ju-88 bombers had ranges of about 2,000 kilometers, barely sufficient to reach the nearest Ural factories and return. Sustained bombing campaigns were impossible. The Soviets exploited this immunity, placing their most critical production facilities beyond German reach. The Soviet rail system's different gauge proved unexpectedly valuable. As noted earlier, the wider track spacing meant German forces could not immediately use captured Soviet railways. Conversion required physical reconstruction of track beds, a process taking weeks per kilometre. This forced German logistics to rely on inadequate road networks and limited converted rail capacity. Meanwhile, Soviet evacuation trains rolled eastward on intact railways, maintaining connections between relocated factories and the resources they needed. German advances cut some rail lines, forcing desperate evacuations and the abandonment of some facilities, but the main evacuation routes through the Urals remained open throughout the critical period. The winter of 1941 to 1942 provided unintended protection for the relocated factories during their most vulnerable period. German forces, unprepared for Russian winter conditions, were incapable of major offensive operations from December through March. This operational pause gave evacuated factories precious months to become fully operational before facing renewed German offensives. By the time German forces launched their 1942 summer offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, Soviet war production was not only recovered but accelerating. The factories no longer faced immediate threat of capture. The relocated industrial complex in the Urals formed an integrated production system by 1943 that exceeded the pre-war industrial capacity and efficiency and output. Tankograd, the Magnitogorsk steel plant, the Chelyabinsk tractor works, and dozens of smaller facilities created a concentration of war production unmatched anywhere in the world. This industrial region, thousands of miles from enemy action, operated continuously throughout the war, never facing bombing, never suffering from disrupted logistics, never losing workers to evacuation. German industry, by contrast, faced increasing Allied bombing from 1943 onward, forcing dispersal of production into smaller, less efficient facilities and draining resources into air defense rather than production. The human cost of the evacuation and the brutal working conditions in the relocated factories has never been fully calculated. Soviet records from this period were deliberately obscure, and many documents were destroyed or lost. Estimates suggest several 100,000 workers died from exposure, starvation, disease, and industrial accidents during the evacuation and the first year of operations in the new locations. These deaths were never acknowledged publicly. The workers were simply replaced by new arrivals, often prisoners from the Gulag system or peasants conscripted from collective farms. The Soviet system's callous disregard for individual life enabled achievements that more humane societies could never have accomplished. Yet this criticism must be balanced against the alternative. If the Soviet Union had not evacuated its industry, if those factories had been captured or destroyed by German forces, the war would have been lost. Germany would have won by default as Soviet forces ran out of weapons and ammunition. The Nazi regime would have enslaved or exterminated tens of millions of Soviet citizens in the occupied territories. Against this counterfactual, the deaths of several 100,000 workers in the evacuation, tragic though they were, represented the lesser evil. The workers themselves understood this calculation and accepted it, however reluctantly. By 1943, the industrial evacuation success was undeniable. Soviet tank production reached 29,000 units that year, compared to German production of 12,000 including assault guns. Aircraft production was 40,000 Soviet versus 25,000 German. Artillery, ammunition, trucks, every category showed Soviet superiority. The material balance had shifted completely from June 1941, when Germany held overwhelming advantages, to a situation where Soviet forces could sustain offensive operations continuously, while German forces struggled to replace losses. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated this transformation. Germany launched Operation Citadel with 2,700 tanks and assault guns, representing the majority of available German armour on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces defending the Kursk salient possessed approximately 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, with strategic reserves of another 1,500. This 2-to-1 numerical superiority, combined with defensive preparations, enabled the Soviets to absorb the German attack and launch counteroffensives that pushed German forces back across a broad front. German losses at Kursk were irreplaceable. Soviet losses, while higher, were replaced within weeks from factory production. Albert Speer, German Minister of Armaments, later acknowledged that Germany could never match Soviet production capacity despite his best efforts to rationalize German industry. In his memoirs, he wrote that Soviet industrial evacuation was one of the supreme achievements of the war, comparable to the American victory at Midway or the British code-breaking at Bletchley Park. Speer understood that Germany's defeat was inevitable once Soviet production reached the levels it achieved in 1943, regardless of German tactical or operational successes. The numbers were simply too overwhelming to overcome. The industrial evacuation's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The Ural industrial region remained the heart of Soviet heavy industry throughout the Cold War. Tankograd continued producing tanks for decades. The aircraft factories in Siberia built the fighters and bombers of the Soviet Air Force. The steel plants supplied the Soviet Union's massive military-industrial complex. The infrastructure created in desperate circumstances in 1941 to 1942 became permanent, shaping Soviet economic geography for generations. The human legacy is more ambiguous. The workers who accomplished this feat received little recognition during the war and almost none afterward. Stalin preferred to emphasize military achievements rather than industrial ones, perhaps because the evacuation success implicitly acknowledged the disasters of 1941 that had made evacuation necessary. The workers returned to anonymity, their contributions forgotten or minimized. Only in recent decades have Russian historians begun documenting individual stories and recognizing the scale of what was accomplished. The final accounting reveals Operation Barbarossa's fundamental miscalculation. Hitler and his generals assumed capturing Soviet industrial regions would cripple Soviet war-making capacity. They were correct that capturing those regions would eliminate much of Soviet production. They were catastrophically wrong in assuming the Soviets would passively accept this loss. The industrial evacuation, improvised in the chaos of military disaster, demonstrated capabilities Hitler could not imagine and resilience his ideology could not acknowledge. A totalitarian state that viewed its citizens as expendable proved capable of mobilizing them for achievements that still astonish historians today. From June to November 1941, while German armies advanced 600 miles and captured territory containing 40% of the Soviet population, the Soviet Union relocated 1,523 major industrial enterprises using 1.5 million railway cars, transported 10 million workers and their families across distances averaging 1,500 miles, rebuilt these factories in open fields during winter, and resumed production within months. This represented the greatest strategic industrial relocation in history, accomplished under conditions of unprecedented stress and sacrifice. The evacuated factories would produce the tanks, aircraft, and artillery that destroyed the Wehrmacht. Hitler convinced himself he had crippled Soviet industry. He never knew they had simply moved it beyond his reach and rebuilt it stronger than before. This miscalculation, this failure of imagination, doomed Nazi Germany as surely as any military defeat. The factories that rolled eastward on those desperate trains in 1941 built the weapons that rolled westward through Berlin in 1945